Hello, welcome to Baltic World. My name is Crispin. The nuclear spectre has already emerged in the war in Ukraine. President Putin has placed his nuclear forces on an elevated status of alert. Meanwhile, Belarus has amended its constitution to abrogate its non-nuclear position, meaning that it can host Russian nuclear weapons on its own soil. This has caused many to speculate, would Vladimir Putin resort to nuclear weapons and under what circumstances? Now, for those that don't know my background, I am a nuclear specialist by trade, specializing in Russia's nuclear forces, capabilities, and doctrine. And over the next while, I'm going to explain the nuclear dynamics of this conflict as I see it. This is just my personal opinion. It doesn't represent any organization. It is the same view that I would express if asked to do so in a classified setting. I'm just putting it out there for everyone to consider. To begin, I'm going to discuss how the thinking around nuclear weapons has evolved, particularly as it pertains to Europe, and then focusing on Russia's thinking and doctrine in particular. At the end of the Second World War, the United States demobilized the majority of its armed forces. This did not occur with the Soviet Union, which militarized the entire communist bloc. This meant that Western Europe, which had been demolished by the Second World War, was at real threat of Soviet invasion. The United States, not wanting to pump money straight back into defense, had a trump card. It was the only country in the world that had nuclear weapons. And so the United States, as a kind of cheap mechanism, decided it would rely on nuclear deterrence to prevent the Soviet Union from invading Western Europe, because the threat of annihilation would, in theory, prevent the Soviets from doing so. In 1949, however, the Soviet Union exploded its first fission-type weapon. This meant that the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, but also a massive field army threatening all of Western Europe. The United States, not wanting to match the Soviet conventional power, decided that it would race ahead in its nuclear production, leading to what we now know as the nuclear arms race. During the Cold War, the United States did maintain a tactical and strategic advantage when it came to nuclear technology. After all, its missiles were far more advanced than those of the Soviet Union, which is why the Soviets decided to compensate by building ever larger nuclear weapons. For example, the largest nuclear test ever conducted was the Tsar bomb of 50 megatons. You can see it on YouTube. It was so powerful that the shockwave was detected on its third rotation around the world. As comparison, that explosion was 300 times as powerful as the nuclear bomb that destroyed the city of Hiroshima. The reason the Russians kept going larger is because the Americans could rely on its highly accurate advanced rocketry systems, missile technology, that could hit Russian targets with a high degree of accuracy. If you could do that, you don't need that much explosive yield to destroy an entire city. The Soviets wanted to know that they could detonate their nuclear weapon a long way from an intended target and still hold that city at risk. The United States retained an edge in delivery systems. However, its ever-increasing dependency on nuclear deterrence to prevent a Soviet conventional invasion of Western Europe led to some absurdly dangerous situations. For example, America developed new non-strategic, low-yield and variable-yield nuclear weapons ostensibly for battlefield use to stop an incoming invasion from the Soviet Union. This meant that nuclear weapons were deployed to forward units, meaning that nuclear weapons would be relied on very early if hostilities ever broke out. Some devices were absolutely insane. For example, the Davy Crockett was a miniaturized 10-ton nuclear weapon, which was maybe 1,000 times smaller than your average Hiroshima fission device. Indeed, the range of this weapon was smaller than the actual blast radius, being an absolute weapon of desperation for any soldier. A series of studies in the late 60s and early 70s showed that nuclear war in Europe would be totally unconstrained and would rapidly lead to a strategic nuclear exchange between the two great superpowers. As a result, the United States decided that it would increase dramatically the strength of its conventional forces deployed in Europe, with a view of retiring some of its forward deployed battlefield nuclear weapons, but also meaning that it could defend Western Europe with conventional means against any Soviet onslaught for at least a period of several weeks to months. This would strengthen the firebreak between conventional and nuclear war. The important thing to remember here is that originally there was no taboo against using nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons were a new thing. They were known to be incredibly destructive, and that their use could be counterproductive, particularly if you resulted in a strategic nuclear exchange. However, there wasn't actually any inherent repugnance on the part of decision makers to refrain from using them. This only occurred when nuclear arms control agreements gathered steam, the signing and ratification of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for example, but also the extending firebreaks between the conventional and nuclear warfighting in Europe, and the constraint placed on US and Soviet allies to prevent proliferation abroad. Right up until the late 1980s, all of this was predicated on an assumption that the Soviet Union enjoyed conventional superiority in Europe. That is, if the Soviet army invaded Western Europe, eventually the United States would have to rely on nuclear weapons in order to stop them. This meant that the Soviet Union had to believe that the fall of Western Europe to Soviet power was such a threat to the United States that the Americans would be willing to initiate a nuclear war to prevent it. The Americans were excellent at conveying that credibility, and that's what led to a relatively stable relationship between the Eastern Bloc and the Western sphere until the 1990s. As the Cold War drew to a close, a number of developments in the nuclear space occurred in rapid succession. The first of these is the dramatic downscaling of nuclear stockpiles in both countries. New arms control agreements such as the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty absolutely removed battlefield weapons from Europe as well as many other places. Ceilings were placed on the strategic nuclear stockpiles of the United States and Russia, while overall nuclear dangers appeared to abate for a time with a new spirit of cooperation between the two countries. New nuclear dangers did emerge, of course. In the late 90s, both India and Pakistan exploded their nuclear devices. Pakistan's nuclear arsenal is growing faster than just about anyone else's. China has expanded and diversified its nuclear arsenal, and of course North Korea has broken out, including with thermonuclear weapons. The second big nuclear development is the incredible weakness of the Russian Federation relative to the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, the Americans believed that the Soviets had military superiority. That nobody believes that the Russian Federation could defeat Europe in a conventional fight, let alone the United States. This has meant that the Russian Federation, with its vast stockpile of nuclear weapons, has grown to depend on that as a first strike weapon in the same way that the United States was thinking about this in the late 1940s when it was the only country to have nuclear weapons and sought to defend Western Europe without a standing conventional army. This has meant that Russian thinking about the nuclear use has evolved in a distinctly operational way. New technologies for battlefield use, such as nuclear sea mines, cruise missiles, torpedoes, things that would allow Russia to equalize against a conventional foe by employing nuclear weapons first. Russia thinks about nuclear weapons in terms of their actual utility, with a distinct category of nuclear weapons being for their strategic defense, i.e. retaliating against foreign cities, preventing them from initiating a nuclear strike on Russia. However, non-strategic nuclear weapons, in particular low-yield nuclear weapons, have a wide degree of application in Russia's strategic thinking, hoping to operationalize situations in which they could fight a so-called limited nuclear war. This is because Russia's vast arsenal of nuclear weapons gives it a tactical advantage should the threshold ever be crossed from conventional war to nuclear war. That is, if Russia finds itself outmatched in the conventional space, it has an incentive to escalate matters to a nuclear conflict because the other side will either back down for fear of nuclear annihilation, or if they chose to match in a proportional way, well, Russia has far more nuclear weapons that it can rely upon. A third nuclear development has been the expansion of NATO right to Russia's western border. When NATO ended at West Germany, it was credible for the United States to initiate a nuclear war against the Soviet Union to prevent the latter from controlling all of Western Europe. However, the Article 5 commitment remains unchanged, with NATO including all of the Baltic countries. So an attack on one is an attack on all, and that includes the nuclear assurances. This throws up the question, will the United States really go for nuclear annihilation over the independence of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, especially given the fact that they had been occupied for 40 years during the Cold War, and the Americans never contemplated going to war over them prior to this. A fourth development relates to personnel. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States realized that the threat posed by nuclear weapons was the greatest challenge of our time. This meant that they found the absolute best and brightest that they had respectively and pushed them into nuclear thinking to manage the nuclear strategy and risks. Then when the Cold War ended, nuclear weapons fell off the radar and the best and brightest fell into different fields: technology, human rights, climate change, etc., whereas those ending up in the nuclear space, where they're often the most mediocre you can imagine. And I'm thinking of highly decorated Ivy League individuals who just are abysmal when it comes to basic nuclear strategy. Now, this is me definitely not panning all nuclear strategists. There are some bright sparks out there. But in terms of comparison with previous generations, they are not in the same league. That means when decision makers go to their nuclear experts getting advice, the advice they receive is often substandard. Okay, bringing all of that together, what does this mean for Vladimir Putin and Ukraine today? Well, the fear that people have been expressing is that if Ukraine continues to hold out, if Vladimir Putin's own position in Russia becomes tenuous, he may resort to nuclear weapons as a desperate escalation to stave off military defeat. Indeed, one of the reasons that NATO has not joined the fight directly on the side of Ukraine against Russia is because Russia has an incentive in a war against Europe to rapidly escalate to use battlefield nuclear weapons early in a conflict. And I think that NATO will continue to be careful not to cross obvious naked red lines of war against the Russian Federation. However, there are two immediately foreseeable scenarios in which Russia could use nuclear weapons in a highly limited and specific way to gain some strategic advantage. The first will occur if the foreign support flowing into Ukraine proves so successful that the Russian army is bogged down in perpetuity and that ultimate victory appears forever elusive. If this occurs, then Vladimir Putin will highly likely conduct a major nuclear weapons test. The CTBT, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, has not been ratified by several important countries, including the United States, China, and India, but there has been a general moratorium. There is also an atmospheric test ban treaty which prevents nuclear weapons being detonated up there in the sky. These norms have constrained the spread of nuclear weapons across the world, but they've come with a drawback, and that is that people no longer fully remember the true, awesome, destructive power of nuclear weapons. Absolutely, without question, Russia can exterminate all life in Europe, most life in the world, in a single afternoon. In just a week, we have seen the entire international community rally around Ukraine, supplying it with weapons and equipment to fight the Russian invaders, money to support the civilian population, and to close Russia off economically from the international order. This means that Russia's paranoia will be fueled, and they will want to demonstrate their strength in the form of a nuclear explosion. By testing a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere with a lot of high-resolution cameras, the international community will have that cold chill of nuclear apocalypse. They will once again apprehend the true destructive might of Russia's nuclear arsenal and begin to wonder how far they want to push things in order to support Ukraine's independence. In other words, this could be a tactic used by Vladimir Putin to try and stem the tide of foreign support flowing into Ukraine. The other credible scenario is if the Russian army is ultimately successful in suppressing Ukrainian resistance, occupying most of that country, but at staggering loss of life. Let's say most of the cities are leveled and carpet bombing, hundreds of thousands, millions of casualties, including civilian casualties. And the international outcry is such that they continue to support insurgencies, training people abroad, do everything in their power to turn Ukraine into a permanent ulcer for Russia. Well, in that scenario, it is highly probable that the Russian military will use a low-yield nuclear weapon in a battlefield scenario against Western Ukraine purely to demonstrate resolve and to threaten the European countries into backing down. Say, look, we have now captured Ukraine. We plan to terminate hostilities. Do you want to push this further? It's a last solemn warning to prevent international support for an ongoing insurgency. This is entirely within Russia's operational doctrine and very foreseeable should this war drag into a horrible, quagmire, bitter, lengthy conflict in which Russian victory is Pyrrhic. Okay, so what should our strategy be in response? Well, if the Ukrainians continue to put up successful, determined resistance and Vladimir Putin conducts a nuclear weapons test, then we absolutely should not overreact to it. Much of the strategic utility of the test is the chilling effect it'll have on the rest of us. The best thing that we can do is to carry on as if it had not happened at all, address it in the context of nuclear norms and laws such as the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty, but then continue to supply Ukraine unabated. More importantly, the United States must maintain its diplomatic channels with Russia. A lot of things were severed when the hostilities broke out, but there has to be an end game planned out, i.e., the Russians, if they withdraw all of their military forces, need to be reintegrated into the community of nations with Vladimir Putin still in power. If there is a change of government in Russia, it can only happen within Russia itself. It can't be a precondition of having sanctions removed and the like. There has to be an acceptance that Vladimir Putin is the leader of Russia and can remain so from the eyes of the international community, provided Russia restores its compliance with international laws and norms. This may not be what everybody wants. A lot of people will feel like Vladimir Putin is an international war criminal and needs to answer for his crimes, but we don't want to push them into a corner. There may still be significant political change in Russia, but that must be organized and carried out by the Russians themselves. It can't be a precondition imposed by the West. Meanwhile, the West should feel confident and not deterred by Russian nuclear weapons in order to impose what it sees as a new set of norms. Ukraine can join the EU and NATO, as can Finland and Sweden. There will be limits placed on the military forces in Eastern Europe, but Russia will be expected to, in good faith, engage in proper arms control arrangements, particularly addressing non-strategic nuclear weapons. Indeed, there's something specific the United States can propose. Almost 10 years ago now, Dr. Calvin Robertson and myself promoted a minimum yield threshold treaty that would restrict the deployment and manufacture of low-yield nuclear weapons. This is a category of non-strategic nuclear weapons that carry particular risks and can be brought under arms control agreements for the first time. Given the nuclear dangers that are surging around the world, this is something that is well overdue and gives Russia a lot of the credibility that it seeks, i.e., in nuclear arms control, Russia is still a respected international superpower. Therefore, if Russia was to withdraw its military forces from Ukraine, engage in meaningful agreements on non-strategic nuclear weapons, then Russia could be rewarded with sanctions relief, reconstituting it in the family of nations, and putting this war behind us. Regarding the other scenario, where Ukraine's military has been defeated, the country occupied, and Russia uses a low-yield nuclear weapon on Ukrainian territory as a warning to the West, well, that is still hypothetical at this stage, so I don't want to get too much into the spectrum of our responses. However, that would be of a more military character, and I'll reserve that for another time. I'll finish this video with a quick message to the young superlative minds out there who are contemplating what to pursue as a career. Consider nuclear strategy and arms control. When I was coming up through the ranks, the old Cold Warriors were lingering on well past retirement years because there was no one credible able to replace them. These days, the community is small, and without insulting any nuclear strategist or career field expert, there are people out there that are just not up to scratch compared to generations past. Meanwhile, the dangers have absolutely not abated. They're getting worse. Proliferation is affecting everything. India, Pakistan, North Korea, China, Russia, the United States, Israel, the Middle East, all different new dangers are emerging for this century. Nuclear risks are with us, and this is a humanity-preserving enterprise. So instead of just being all in high-stakes poker or working for Elon Musk, there are minds out there that should actually be in game theory nuclear strategy. That's my view. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave them down below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.